Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War and, in general, the 1950s. So, I'm fond of this era. This is the decade of my birth. So, some of this I can tell you about firsthand. Not the first parts of it, luckily, but anyway. Let's go back to the Second World War and the conclusion of the Second World War. A lot of this was mapped out at several conferences in the middle and the end of the war, where Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met to decide, not so much in these conferences on military strategy, as on the diplomatic strategy for concluding the war. They were, by 1943, confident that they would end up victorious. The real question was, what would the post-war world look like? What were things going to be like once Japan and Germany and Italy had been defeated? It wasn't obvious what the shape of Europe ought to be, what the shape of the rest of the world ought to be. The first of these conferences was held in Tehran in 1943, and Sir Alan Brooke, who was a diplomat at the meetings, came back saying that Stalin has the president in his pocket. Already by 1943, Roosevelt was taking the side of Stalin against Churchill on a number of key issues, and that continued at the Yalta Conference in 1945, where the post-war world was really mapped out in great detail. In fact, here's what FDR said about Stalin. I think that if I give him everything I possibly can, and ask nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of democracy and peace. Now, what was it that justified, or that gave any rationale for Roosevelt's confidence in Stalin at this point?
Well, didn't he assert that he was needed this territory as a buffer zone, basically, for Russia's Western Front? Or, I'm sorry, am I in the wrong? Oh, never mind.
No, good. I mean, yeah, it's hard to know what made... There were specific proposals at Yalta, and we'll get to the details of those proposals in a moment. But there was also just a personal faith, the question of who trusted whom. And oddly enough, Roosevelt trusted Stalin more than he trusted Churchill. And so we've already seen an image from the conference. Here they are, Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, sitting there discussing things, with military brass from a variety of countries in the background. I promised you a silly photograph on this. Here is a classic picture of Stalin confiding in Roosevelt, who is looking away, and Churchill looking on with his cigar. Here's the silly dancing girl version. Anyway, Roosevelt refused to coordinate either before the meetings or actually during the conference with Churchill. You might have thought that Roosevelt and Churchill would have conferred and had a sort of common ground and had some agreed upon strategy and so on. That was not true. In fact, Churchill urged Roosevelt that they ought to have some combined strategy before the conference. Roosevelt thought that was cheating, that would put Stalin in an awkward position, so he declined to have one-on-one meetings beforehand. And so he simply went in without any preparation in advance with Churchill. He didn't back Churchill's demand for international supervision of Polish elections. There was an agreement at the conference that Poland would be recreated. It would no longer be divided up between Germany and Russia, but that Russia would cede its portion, Germany would cede its portion, and Poland would go back to being an independently existing nation. But there were to be elections then in Poland, which was to be reconstituted as a democratic nation. And who would supervise those? Stalin said, I will. Okay, Churchill said, no, there should be an international group that does it. Roosevelt backed Stalin and said, yes, it's fine if Stalin simply supervises the elections. He also announced that US forces would be out of Europe within 2 years. And so declared at the outset that with the war ending in 1945, all US troops would be withdrawn from Europe by 1947. Now, did that take place?
No.
No, in fact, they're still there. Okay, so 2 years was somewhat of an optimistic timetable. Nevertheless, Churchill was dismayed at this announcement. And why? Why would he have been upset? Yeah.
If the U.S. isn't there especially if the U.S. isn't allied with Britain in order to keep democracy as a priority, you have Stalin, who's not a big fan of democracy, and he's just going to take what he can.
Good. Stalin is no fan of democracy, so Churchill right away realizes, hold on a second, if the United States isn't there, there's nothing to protect democracy in Europe. Why not the British and French? Well, the French had caved in 6 weeks, right? And so they had no military presence that was really powerful enough to constitute any significant deterrent. What about Britain itself? Britain was pretty much exhausted by the war. The British homeland had taken significant poundings. And so the British army was in no shape to guarantee Polish independence or anything else. Yeah.
But also to add to that, like you can't just go into a country and destroy everything, or into an area, destroy everything and then leave. And that's another thing. You need troops there. I mean, like, we're stuck in that quandary. We're stuck in that quandary in Iraq.
We do it all
Yes.
the time.
It's like you go in and you win a war, but then you're left with a bunch of destroyed buildings, destroyed infrastructure, and you have to be able to fix it. So you can't just say, oh, we're gonna. I mean, in World War II, if you can't leave in 2 years, I mean, you're not gonna be leaving Iraq in 2 years.
Oh, okay, good. And maybe some of you have seen the movie The Princess Bride. And one of the great lines in it is, that's a classic mistake, like getting involved in a land war in Asia. And that's the joke part. But there's a serious part too, which is why is it so dangerous to get involved in land wars, even if you win, even if you destroy the opposing military. Now there's this question of a destroyed part of the world, right? And civil society has to be reconstituted there. You have to do something to help people get started in the process of rebuilding, not only rebuilding economically and the physical infrastructure and so on, but rebuilding political institutions. And often that process of reconstruction is much more difficult than the actual initial process of destruction. And so Churchill, in part, is recognizing this, saying, wait a minute, the job is not done. Even once Hitler and Mussolini have been defeated, there's a serious question about rebuilding political institutions. Yeah.
Well, isn't this I think this kind of goes back to like Kagan's idea of making sure that there's one global hegemon, because unless you have the ability to try and rebuild that, inevitably there will be a power vacuum and that'll cause infighting. So even if you've eliminated what was once something that was bad, if you have leveled the playing field, that gives rise to infighting, because inevitably other people want to take control, which means you have to have a guiding hand to lead to the rebuilding of something else, otherwise fighting will be inevitable.
Good. What's to prevent conflict from breaking out again over all of this? She's talking about one single global hegemon. You might say, look, there has to be a police officer in the block who can help people sort out these disagreements and sort out the conflicts that are inevitably going to occur. Who could that be? Can it be the Soviet Union? Well, the Soviet Union was in what kind of condition by 1945? It was defeating Hitler's armies and pushing them back toward Berlin,
But it was wrecked.
But it was wrecked, exactly. The scorched earth policy, not only did Hitler inflict terrible damage on the Soviet Union inflicted terrible damage on itself by the scorched earth policy that was trying to make Hitler's supply lines give out. And what about the British? As I said, they were pounded and weak. The French, they had collapsed within 6 weeks and were in no position to do this. Who could the policeman be? Who can sort out the conflicts here except the United States? Yeah.
I will say, we always talk about pulling out too early, but there's also the other extreme, which is you become the hated occupying force.
Exactly right. And so there's really a dilemma here. Because on the one hand, if you just sort of pull out, you've got this power vacuum, you've got the recipe for conflict, you've got no working political institutions. But if you stay to try to rebuild, then you face the opposite problem. The problem that you are now the enemy, you're the one who is trying to impose a solution on other people that they don't want. And so really there's a very difficult political and military dilemma to be solved here. And Churchill and Roosevelt, quite legitimately I think, had very different perspectives about that difficult problem. Now in the end, I think in World War II, in some ways, in some areas this worked out very well, in other areas not well at all. We've faced the same problem over the past decade in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as we've seen, it is very difficult to actually come up with a good solution to this sort of problem. Now there's another factor that happened. As soon as the conference had been held, Molotov announced that Polish elections would be held Soviet style. Okay. There's a good Magnum style joke, hidden here somewhere. But yes, what does it mean to have Soviet style elections?
Kill everybody? Have dishonest elections?
Well, there were elections in the Soviet Union.
They were like rigged.
But yes, they were rigged. The person who was supposed to win always won with something like 97% of the vote. Now, why not 100% of the vote? Well, you want to show this was really a contest. It wasn't rigged. But it was always overwhelming, okay? And so there wasn't really any freedom to vote for the candidate you wanted. And this announcement was greeted by Churchill with complete alarm because he knew exactly what that meant. Yes?
How could Roosevelt, after being through this whole conflict, be so oblivious? Or I don't even know if he's oblivious, just like how could he throw his hands down and be like, whatever, I don't care.
Exactly. That's the question. How did Roosevelt adopt this sort of attitude? Why did he trust Stalin? Why did he sell out Eastern Europe? Because what he ended up doing is permitting the Soviets to control not only Poland, but Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, a variety of other countries in Eastern Europe, as well as, ones that were not to remain countries much longer, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Why did he do it? Why did he permit Stalin to take control of these areas? Why didn't he insist on international supervision of elections? And so forth. There are a number of theories, and so here are some possible answers. I don't think it's clear what the answer to your question really is. One is that he was sick. He died barely 2 months after the Yalta Conference, and take a look, actually, at those photographs again.
Oh, God.
He does not look well, right? I mean, he's by this point very old. He is in very poor health. He was able to stay alive as long as he did, only by frequent trips to a spa in Georgia. Georgia the state, not Georgia the part of Russia, which was actually very close to Yalta. And so he was in bad shape. So one possible answer is, look, he was a very sick man. Another is that he was simply too trusting. He took the alliances seriously. He was, by this point, you might say, taking Churchill a little bit for granted, but was excited about the possibility of a real friendship with the Soviet Union and thought there was more of a prospect for that than there really was. After all, it was not long after this that the bombing of Dresden and a variety of other campaigns started, largely at Stalin's request, saying, Stalin saying, do something to break German resistance, especially in the East. And the result of that were a lot of decisions that now look to us to be immoral, attacking population centers for no good military reason. So some of this may have been that he was simply too trusting of Stalin for a variety of reasons. Then, of course, there's another factor. His top aide, Harry Hopkins, was a Soviet agent. There were a lot of highly placed Soviet agents by this point in the Roosevelt administration. And so, to some extent, he's getting advice from people who are themselves Soviet spies. And he trusts them, and they're telling him, well, of course you can trust Stalin, blah, blah, blah. And so he's relying on his own assistants, who are, in some cases, Soviet spies. Now, however you think about this, the result was that Roosevelt did trust Stalin, and he did sell out Eastern Europe. Churchill was appalled by the results. And here is what he said. Basically what happened is that the Soviet army's advance got to a certain point in Europe. The American, British, and French free armies got to a certain point, and that just became the dividing line between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Western Europe got real democratic institutions. Elections in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the rest were held Soviet style, meaning that communist parties were installed in all of those countries. Churchill, noting this, gave a famous speech known as the Iron Curtain speech. And here's what he said: from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Beyond that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe, what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high, and in many cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow. And so here is the way it really ended up. Germany itself was divided. Interestingly enough, Eisenhower was ordered to stop his advance at the Elbe River to allow the Soviets to take over Eastern Germany. The armies would have, through natural progression, met somewhere in here, but Roosevelt gave the order to stop so that the Soviets could advance to that point. So all of these countries, the eastern portion of Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all fell under Soviet control. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania were absorbed into the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia became neutralized. It was not really officially part of the Soviet bloc, nevertheless had a communist government and was in some ways independent, but in some ways closely related to the Soviet Union in policy terms. Albania was here doing its own thing under Chinese influence for no good reason that I can really explain easily. In any case, well, also I should point out up here, also sort of neutralized here, not part of the Western Pact, but not part of the Eastern Empire either, were Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, Finland, all of whom were non-aligned and tried to maintain a kind of neutrality. Yeah, Maria?
Well, to be fair, a lot of the Soviets felt that they put a lot of blood into the war, and their whole land was basically ruined, so they felt like they were entitled to like some support from countries around them. So I'm not saying that they were entitled to like take over them military-wise, but they did feel that there was like a threat from the West, and they needed like all the resources they could get because it was an uneven playing field. Because they were racked up to the war, and the United States wasn't.
Ah, well, good. Yes. If you were Stalin, why would you care about this band of countries right here?
They weren't burned. Industry.
Well, some of them were, were in relatively good shape after the war. Others, like Poland, were devastated. So
Czech had the weapons, right?
they had the weapons. At this point, though, those factories had largely been bombed by the Allies, so they weren't producing much anymore. But yes, this was a very rich industrial region, and certainly could become one again. Yes.
Didn't they kind of like protect them from the West a little bit more?
Yeah, exactly. Think about the betrayal that Stalin felt. He thought he had an agreement with Hitler, right? Hitler broke it and invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union suffered horrendously as a result of that. And so it's quite understandable that he would think, wait a minute, Europe has been a threat to us. Now, I think the thought that Britain, France, and the United States at this stage were going to be a threat seems unlikely. But on the other hand, Germany is something that Stalin did not want to reconstitute itself. Despite the fact that by 1945, Germany was no longer a significant power, its armies had been devastated, its cities bombed, its factories destroyed. Nevertheless, he saw Germany as the central power of Europe, the country that was going to reconstitute itself, that was going to again pose a threat to Russia. He didn't want it to be a threat. He basically said, look, the Germans have attacked us in very recent history. Earlier, Napoleon attacked, and in 1812, for example, marched on Moscow. His idea was, never again. We want a band of influence here that will protect us from the powers of Central and Western Europe that in the past have attacked Russia and wrought great devastation upon her. And so it's not just sort of an imperialist impulse, though it is partly that. It is partly a sense that, look, several times over the past centuries, this has been the route for an invasion of Russia. We want a buffer that will prevent that from happening. And so there were some reasons why it would be sensible to think that a buffer like that would be desirable. Stalin also, by this point, was really getting, how can I put it? Stalin was never a nice guy. Stalin was never somebody to be trusted, never somebody who had a strong faith in democratic institutions. But by the end of the war, and especially by the early 50s, he was really more and more convinced that everyone was out to get him. And a certain number of people certainly were out to get him. So, the fact that you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you. But nevertheless, his decisions become less and less rational as time goes on. It's hard to say in 1945 what his state of mind is, and to what extent there were legitimate defensive reasons for his interest in this, and to what extent there were other kinds of goblins in his head that were driving him to do certain things. But in any case, it's not hard to see why a leader of Russia would have said, first in 1812 and now in 1941 we get attacked, we have to do something to try to prevent this from happening again. Roosevelt died in April of 1945, and so did not see the actual end of the war, even the war in Europe, much less the war in Japan. The person who took over as president was his vice president, Harry S. Truman. Truman was a fascinating character. He was himself a hat maker from Missouri. He was an unpretentious sort of man. He said, the buck stops here. He took responsibility for making decisions. He was a very plain-spoken person. He was somebody who had not only an image of honesty and directness and sincerity, but I think really was honest, direct, and sincere in a way that, frankly, is unusual among politicians. One of the first things he did is purge pro-Soviet officials from his administration. He was somebody who recognized that the Soviets had managed to infiltrate the Roosevelt administration at a variety of levels. And he quietly got rid of people. He didn't make much of a fuss about it, but he did recognize that there were Soviet spies, or at least sympathizers at a variety of levels, and he tried to get rid of them. Henry Wallace leaked a memo arguing for unilateral disarmament and increased trade with Russia. Truman, as a result, fired him. Wallace ended up running for president in 1948 to replace Truman. Didn't get all that much support. But in any case, Truman had no patience with anybody who did not see the kind of person Stalin was, and thought himself, I think, that Roosevelt had been snookered at Yalta with respect to the end of the war. Now, the perception of Soviet influence in American government was not confined to Truman. It spread to a lot of levels of the American government, and in particular, the House of Representatives created what it called the Un-American Activities Committee. There was worry about communist influence in government and in a variety of other institutions. And so they held hearings to try to ferret out communists and communist sympathizers in a variety of areas of government and in a variety of other places. They were worried about communist subversion. This is the era of the Hollywood blacklist. It's the era of the Alger Hiss case. Alger Hiss was accused of spying. Whittaker Chambers, in particular, who had been part of the same communist cell, allegedly accused him of spying for the Soviet Union. Eventually, Hiss was convicted of perjury, though not of treason. There's a book, Witness, that Chambers wrote about this entire development. For years, this remained controversial. There are still people who think of it as controversial, although when the Soviet Union fell, a lot of papers were released, and there is a spy referred to as Alice, A-L-E-S, who seems to fit Hiss very, very well. So most historians now think Hiss was indeed guilty, though some people still deny that Alice was Alger Hiss. In any case, this then gave rise to Senator Joseph McCarthy and his campaign to get rid of communism and communist sympathizers in American life. McCarthy, in 1950, so this is still under the Truman administration, made headlines just 2 weeks after the Hiss verdict, saying that he had a list of members of the Communist Party who were working in the State Department. Okay? He had dozens of names. This grew to eventually hundreds of names of people he accused of being communists or communist sympathizers or members of the Communist Party. Now, there really had been many people with communist sympathies at the very least in the Roosevelt administration, but Truman had gotten rid of them. So by the time McCarthy started his campaign, he was attacking a problem that had probably, to a large extent, already been solved. In any event, he began attracting a large amount of publicity and a large amount of support. But as time went on, he got less and less support. These hearings were televised. More and more people got involved. There was less and less evidence directed to them. McCarthy himself began drinking heavily and began to seem less and less credible. In any case, the significance of all this, I think, is much greater than you might think given what was actually going on. Very few people were punished as a result of any of this. Few received anything official in the way of punishment. Those were relatively lightly punished. The people who were blacklisted lost jobs initially, but were pretty quickly reinstated. McCarthy himself was censured, and the House Un-American Activities Committee became highly unpopular. And so you might say, what was the actual result of this? Well, it didn't have many results, partly because he didn't have very good evidence, and partly because Truman had already gotten rid of the people against whom there would have been very good evidence. But there are a number of things that you can draw from all of this that have been drawn by historians. One is the inadequacy of libel laws. It was possible to say anything, accuse anyone of anything. And it was very hard for anyone to respond. Suppose I suddenly point to this guy and say, I have information that he is now or once was a member of the Communist Party. Okay? He says, I'm wrong. Okay, good. Now, I've claimed this. He says, he denies it, right? And then I say, well, what would a communist accused of communist sympathies do? Of course, they would deny it. So this proves nothing, etc., etc. Now, it's easy to lose patience with this, but he can rightly think, wait a minute, you've ruined my reputation. You may have lost me my job. And what recourse do I have? Who can hold McCarthy or others making these kinds of irresponsible allegations responsible? And it turned out to be very difficult to do. In order to convict someone of libel or slander, what you have to do is show that they acted in reckless disregard of the truth. They had to do something maliciously, and they had to know it was false. And was it clear that McCarthy knew these allegations were false? Well, maybe in some cases. Probably not, though. Probably he thought there was some kind of evidence. In some cases, it's known that he was accusing people based on a name being on a list, and he was accusing the wrong person. There are lots of people who have suppose he finds John Smith on the list. Which John Smith do you accuse? I'm the only Daniel Bonavac in the world, but that doesn't, most names aren't like that. And so it's easy to have mistaken identity or evidence that, really is not very strong evidence. So it doesn't really satisfy the requirements of a law of libel, but nevertheless, it's highly destructive.
You don't think a failure with something that momentous to even cross-check, say, a birth date, is a reckless disregard for the truth?
Well, that's true. I mean, a certain amount of, you would say, look, if you care about the truth at all, you're going to do a certain amount of checking. But suppose someone reports that they have heard something about you, and they have heard it. That's highly irresponsible if there's no very good evidence against you. But what recourse do you really have? Have they done it in reckless disregard of the truth? Perhaps not. Anyway, we see this in politics all the time. This is by no means a dead issue. People make allegations against other people all the time, and they have very little recourse, especially if they're public figures. Another point, institutional cowardice. Who stood up and defended these people? Who at the time said, wait a minute, you can't accuse my employees or my people or my assistant or whoever it is of being a member of the Communist Party. Who defended any of these people? No, in fact, the Hollywood blacklist seems to me a huge black mark not only against McCarthy, but also against Hollywood. Why didn't the studio stand up and say, I don't care what this guy is, he's making brilliant movies? They didn't. People really allowed these allegations to flourish. They did not respond, they did not defend people, and so it really was an instance of institutional cowardice. You would like to think that in the contemporary world, if, for example, an employee of a university were accused of wrongdoing, the university would leap to that person's defense. Most of the time, you would be wrong, okay, no matter how baseless the accusations. It also had an important consequence in that it really tainted the anti-communist attitudes that the Truman administration had. They quickly moved from thinking of Nazism as the main enemy to communism as the main enemy in response to Stalin's takeover of Eastern Europe. They started seeing communism as a serious threat to the American way of life, but McCarthy gave that entire movement a bad name. And so for a long time, people who have not been communist sympathizers have in fact opposed anti-communism. Why? Because it got tainted by McCarthy's excesses. And finally, there was a large blow here to moral confidence. At the end of the war, there was a sense that the United States had been on the right side, that it had defeated this force of evil in the world, that the Soviet Union and its takeover of Eastern Europe was representing a new threat to freedom and a new source of evil. There was a kind of moral clarity that existed there for a short time. But already after the McCarthy hearings, there was much less of a sense of that. Wait a minute, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? And so in that sense, it was a serious blow to moral confidence, to the sense of clear right and wrong that people had at the very end of the war. Americans in 1945 thought we were clearly on the right side. Those guys were clearly wrong. There was a kind of sharp moral distinction to be drawn. The McCarthy era made all of that seem really unclear. And to some extent, the United States had never recovered that sense of moral certainty that it had right at the end of the war. Now, there's a background here, because this concern of McCarthy's for communist influence and so on wasn't totally crazy. And here's the background. There was a current in Marxism, which we might call cultural Marxism. It's independent of the thought of, or the deeds of, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, etc. But it's a strand that arises from a certain kind of question. Why, after all, hadn't the revolution occurred? We've noticed that Lenin, Stalin, a variety of other people said, wait a minute, the revolution is not going to occur on its own. Marx thought that eventually the proletariat would rise and overthrow the bourgeoisie. Didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? The cultural Marxists say, well, I'll tell you why. It's because of the culture. Even if the proletarians are feeling oppressed, even if they would like to bring about some degree of social justice, they're not going to do it because the bourgeoisie dominates the culture. They dominate. Well, what are the aspects of culture that are involved in the transmission of ideas? How do ideas get transmitted to the next generation? Really, some people have said we're always one generation away from barbarism. Civilization, if it's to be preserved, has to be passed on from one generation to the next. How does a civilization get passed? How do values get passed from one generation to the next generation?
Parents.
Families?
Good. Parents, families, that's a main source of transmission. Parents teach their children. Families teach the kids in those families, right? And they give them a sense of values. They pass along a large element of civilization, of culture, not only of specifically what's morally right and wrong, but also just what's appropriate, what's done, what's not done, and so on, what's of value. Yeah.
TV, movies, music, and educational institutions.
Ooh, good. Television, movies, music, okay? All of those convey values and pass along a sense of civilization. How much do you really know about Los Angeles? Probably a lot. But how many of you have actually lived in Los Angeles? Yeah, okay, one person. I know there's another that's usually here, but he's not here today. How many of you have been to Los Angeles? Okay, maybe a fifth of you. How many of you, though, think you know quite a lot about it? No, well, I don't mean that much about it. I mean, like, where is it? Right? What does a typical street in Los Angeles look like? Right? You probably have an image in your mind about all of this. Where? You get it from television. You get it from movies. And the same is true of lots of things. Have you ever been part of a high-powered business meeting? Probably not. But nevertheless, you have an image of what it must be like. Why? From television, movies, and so on. They can transmit a huge amount about the world, a huge amount of what you think is appropriate or inappropriate behavior, of what the world is really like, of what people value and don't value, and so on. What about music? Does music convey values?
Used to, I guess.
It used to, does it now?
No.
Well, maybe not the ones you want.
Yes.
I mean, it just depends on what you're listening to. But a lot of it's like a corporate machine where they just have a formula of like what, 16 and 17-year-olds are going to like. But I get what you're saying.
Well,
I get your point.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that you might say the purely instrumental music, does it convey any sense of value? Well, maybe not. Perhaps a sense of excellence or of something other than excellence. I mean, it is true that a lot of things now are formulas. Most pop songs have the same chord progression. 1, 5, 6, 4.
Yep.
Sometimes people shake it up and it's 6, 4, 1, 5, okay? But, you can do almost, if you think, yeah, I can only play one chord progression and that's it. You can play at least half the songs that you hear on the radio. And so, yeah, but still the words convey something, right? Nietzsche thought that Wagner's operas conveyed something about German greatness and about moral values of a kind that he was interested in, of authenticity and so on. Contemporary music might convey a different set of values, almost certainly does convey a different set of values. But that's one way of transmitting things. Yeah?
Well, can you say, like, music from the 60s, like, a lot of it was based off of, like, protest chants that they turned into music?
Okay, yes, there might be roots in protest chants, or in folk songs, or in, rhythm and blues, or a variety, right? There might be a sort of social meaning conveyed by music, even apart from the words, just based on the rhythm, the various other aspects of the movie. But yes, I mean, music of all sorts of... Now, actually, here's part of what happens in the 20th century that is relevant to what's going on here. Popular music and serious music divide in a way that had not been the case. Even in the 19th century, people went to popular operas. Handel's oratorios were very popular during their day in the 18th century. In the 20th century, people doing serious music, classical music, became a very different group, and they had a very different audience from those who were doing popular music. And that is a kind of new divide that does have real cultural significance. Also, you mentioned educational institutions. Gramsci's idea, sorry, I didn't mention that from the last slide. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist who stressed cultural Marxism and said, exactly, the values of the bourgeoisie become the common sense of the proletariat. They are passed on through a variety of institutions. So how do you change things? You change those institutions. You get control of the media, of the producers of movies, of television shows, of literature. You gain control of other means of cultural transmission, including educational institutions. And so the key to a revolution, he thought, was in combining social forces to form a historic bloc. And what's required to do that? Take over those institutions that pass on the civilization from one generation to the next. So Gramsci advocated what he called a long march through the institutions. Now, which of those institutions especially transmit culture? Education first on the list, okay? The family, yes, but you can't do a lot about the control of the family. However, schools pass on values. They teach people what's important, what's to be valued, what's significant. So take over institutions of education, take over the arts, especially popular arts, film and so on. The media, non-profit institutions, other groups that convey value and in some way transmit civilization. And the goal, he said, should be to infiltrate them and subvert them. Make them serve the cause of the revolution rather than the cause of the bourgeoisie. So, starting at, well, in the 30s really, but progressing and becoming clear by the 1950s, was the progress of that long march through the institutions. When McCarthy and others pointed us to communist influence in Hollywood, they weren't making that up. Whether or not certain people were actually members of the Communist Party, whether or not that should matter and get you into trouble, nevertheless it was certainly true that the left, and by that I really do mean people who were sympathetic with Stalin, were highly influential in a variety of these institutions. Yeah.
But the problem with that is that if they supposedly do believe in the moral society that they espouse, this marketplace of ideas, this society in which free speech exists, how are they not being entirely hypocritical by trying to suppress that?
Who's the they?
Oh, I'm sorry, the people involved in blacklisting certain people in Hollywood, the people involved in trying to shut down communist influence within American society.
Right, good. Yeah, there's a serious problem here, right? Because these people would have seen themselves as trying to defend freedom and trying to defend tolerance. And yet, in doing that, they suppress people's freedom and act intolerantly, right? So there is a kind of paradox here that faces free institutions and free peoples. What do you do in response to movements that are really, in the end, hostile to freedom and are themselves intolerant? To what degree do you tolerate intolerance? To what extent do you allow people advocating the absence of freedom to be free? And to some extent, you're right. You can end up looking completely hypocritical and, in fact, undermining the very things you value. If you yourself are intolerant, you yourself suppress freedom. And yet the worry is that on the other side, if you don't, they may win. And there goes freedom and there goes tolerance. So I think there really is a paradox here that is not that easily addressed. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but is the free speech thing really that hard to reconcile if you do believe in people's ability and indeed right to decide between different ideas?
Well, okay. You might think, and indeed, I mean, I'm inclined toward that direction of the dilemma, that horn of the dilemma. It seems John Stuart Mill gives the following argument in defense of freedom of speech. He says, look, either something is completely wrong or it's got part of the truth. If it's got the part of the truth, it shouldn't be suppressed because it's important to find the truth in all sorts of partial views where truth has to be separated from error. If it's completely wrong, he says, nevertheless, it is important to defend people's right to say it. Why? Because it helps keep the truth alive. It's important that we recognize the truth as the truth, we be able to defend it. And he says, if you don't allow that, if you don't allow people to challenge the truth with things even that are obviously and directly and completely false, the truth loses its meaning, it loses its vibrancy. People forget how to defend it, they forget what it even means. And so he says, even if something is completely wrong-headed, it must be permitted because it's only in that way that you keep the truth alive. Now, that's one view, and it seems to me a plausible view. However, why weren't people completely persuaded? Why, for example, after the war, was there a movement in many European countries to ban Mein Kampf, to ban the display of Nazi symbolism?
It is associated with something so awful that they don't, I mean, like, even if this actually did happen, I guess you don't want it to be part of your culture.
That's right. There's a sense that, look, these things were so terrible and so devastating in their effects that, no, we can't risk it happening again. And so to this day, Mein Kampf and lots of Nazi symbolism is prohibited in many Western European countries. Now, are they right or wrong to do that? My own inclination is to think they're wrong to do that. And so I agree with you. Better to err on the side of free speech. But people who have been through this have, in many cases, said, do you understand what you're asking me to risk? Am I really to be expected to risk that? The danger here is grave enough, and I've seen that it can triumph. Mill is confident that in the marketplace of ideas, the truth will win. Well, maybe I'm not so confident. And so, although I agree with you in the end, I think it's not an easy call to make. And I can see why certain people say, no, we shouldn't allow Nazis to march in Skokie, or we shouldn't permit certain things to happen, because in fact the risk of these ideas is so great, and they've been so thoroughly historically investigated and discredited, that I'm not willing to listen to them. And so in this case, the worry was, look, these people are really trying to undermine liberty itself. Is that something itself that you have to permit? Now, this sort of thing comes up on all sides of the political spectrum, so you shouldn't think it's all about one kind of thing. In fact, you may be aware there's a petition on the White House website that people have started to allow Texas to secede from the Union. People have started another petition that says anyone who signs the first petition should be exiled from the United States. Okay? Now, well, that's an extraordinary display of intolerance, right? Wait, you even advocate secession? We should throw you out. By the way, that's you're not allowed to be exiled from the United States for anything. That's a cruel and unusual punishment according to the Supreme Court. But that you should get this for advocating something, for signing your name to a petition, that's surely just this kind of thing to say, no, certain ideas must not be tolerated and people should be expelled and so on and so forth. And so you find this all over the place on all sides of different questions. Now, what is clear is that by the 1950s, there was a certain point to these worries. A lot of American writers, a lot of American filmmakers, a lot of leaders of nonprofits, a lot of government workers were actually Marxists. Now, in saying a lot of, I don't mean most, but nevertheless this was a significant presence in many of the arts and in the media and so on. By the 1960s and 70s, schools and universities became strongly Marxist. Again, I don't mean most teachers, most professors were Marxist, but Marxist influence was very strong. And Chambers, notice, as he was involved in a communist cell, he was at the time the senior editor of Time magazine. And by the 1970s, many journalists were on that side and had Marxist sympathies. Yes, Maria?
It's not like you can equate Marxism with Nazism. Like, Marxists believe that it is the capitalist society that's suppressing people's freedom through brainwashing them into competing into this ladder of consumerism and so forth. And it is the Marxists that actually allow people to be free in most, inner sense of freedom. So, I mean, Stalin wasn't advocating it, but because he was a particular person who was messed up in himself. So, but maybe the pure form of communism that maybe Marx had in mind, or Lenin, before people took over and made a mess of it, maybe it's not fair to say it's advocating suppression of freedom, completely or something.
Well, there's an interesting question here, right? Because Hitler too would have said, look, I'm trying to liberate people. I'm trying to craft this ideal society in which people can be authentic and so on. Why is it any more respectable to be a Marxist than to be a Nazi? I don't think that's a trivial question. I'm not trying to answer it. I'm just saying it's a serious question. Yeah.
A lot of my questions when I ask sound like, why do people do these stupid things? But once again, why is there less support for Marxism when obviously, she was just talking about how it might not have been all bad, but whenever it is implemented, whenever Karl Marx's ideas are implemented, they don't work.
Because it was
And then-
implemented, correct?
Well,
But
okay.
Why do people keep going back to this? Maybe Marxism is cool. No, just get rid of it.
Well, yeah. After all, yeah, how has Marxism worked out?
Or just how does it keep gaining support? We've had several times where
Because it's never been done right.
I guess.
That's always the argument. It's never been done right. But of course, why can't the Nazis say that? Oh, yes, it is true. This is a terrible accent. I won't attempt it. Why can't the Nazis say, well, yeah, Hitler took these ideas about National Socialism and unfortunately bound them up with anti-Semitism and all sorts of terrible things, but look, you can't hold that against National Socialism itself. It just wasn't done right. We don't think that's a very respectable position to take. Why is it any better to say, well, yeah, Marxism has failed in Russia, and it's failed in North Korea, and it's failed in China, and it's failed in Eastern Europe, and so on, but nevertheless, it just hasn't been done right. Yeah.
Just prefacing, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but culturally, I think the reason why that it can be more acceptable in our society to be a Marxist than a Naziist is just a sort of societal and cultural vilification of Nazism to a greater extent than communism. Just that in the post-war era, we put so much effort into disregarding that society, whereas because Stalin had allied with us, we were more hesitant to vilify that until later. I just think there's a greater amount of stigma placed upon Nazism societally that perhaps leads to that being the greater evil.
Well, that's a possible explanation. It's to say, look, the Nazis were our enemies and they were defeated, whereas the Marxists in the Soviet Union were our allies, and they weren't defeated. They were part of the victorious coalition, and so that's, of course, we think of them very differently. Yes?
Well, first of all, from what I understand from what you taught us here is that Nazism is more intrinsically tied with the historical movement to conquer other countries than Marxism has been. In terms of just Nazism, like as espoused in like Mein Kampf and that kind of thing, like Nazism is very inherently aggressive, while communism has had this aggressiveness attached to it by people who have tried to implement it in their countries and then wanted to expand it. Like I know that, and then when it does say that it will spread, it says it'll spread from the internal movement in the country. It doesn't say it'll be imposed from the outside. So that seems like a big difference to me.
Well, all right, the Nazi is nationalist, the communist is internationalist, but the Nazi has this image of a Darwinian struggle in which one must be the strong and dominate others. Communism, it seems, might, but does not need to have that aggressive element to it. So yes, there are some important differences that are relevant to the kind of threat they would pose. I have 1 minute left, and you have not let me get to anything that's fun, like Elvis Presley and
The Korean War.
the Korean War, and I Like Ike, etc., etc., and a 1953 yellow Chevrolet like the one I had as a kid. Well, I didn't have, my family had. Anyhow, so I will just say the following. There is a large issue that emerges about how to deal with communism on the international scene. And Truman articulates the Truman Doctrine, which is to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure. We must notice not necessarily those who are choosing communism through an internal process, but if a minority is trying to oppose its will on the majority, if there's an outside pressure, we must assist free people to work out their destinies in their own way. He advocates the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, which it does very successfully, and institutes the Berlin Airlift when Germany is divided and Berlin has free sectors here that are cut off from the rest of Germany. The Soviets try to embargo it. Truman flies supplies in to keep Berlin a free city. West Germany is established, NATO is established, and there is a commitment to contain communism and preserve free institutions. So next time, Roy will start talking about developments in the arts. When we pick up the historical themes again, we'll start here and look at various developments between the 50s and 1960s.